Inflation is the rate at which the price level for goods and services is rising. As inflation rises, every dollar will buy a smaller percentage of a good. An example of this would be that if a country had an inflation rate of 2%, then a $1 pack of gum will cost $1.02 in a year. Most central banks will try to keep an inflation rate of around 2 or 3%. As with any compounded percentage, inflation rates may not seem to have that much of an impact in the short run, but can have larger impacts in the long run. One of the biggest impacts that inflation has is on credit. When someone loans money, they generally assume that they'll get their money back at face value, plus a little interest. But with inflation, the value of that money will decrease over time, and so banks need to take into account inflation rates when determining the interest rate at which to charge for a loan. Inflation can become a problem for creditors if the inflation rate gets out of hand, as the loans owed to the firms will no longer be worth what they once were.
Argentina currently has a few very large problems with their economy. The first of which is that the majority of the country is trying to convert all of their money from the Argentine peso to the more stable American dollar for fear that any Argentine peso that is kept will lose a significant amount of its value overnight due to inflation. This, in addition to the fact that the government is printing way too much money and is unable to take out any debts because of the fact that they have already defaulted on their debt twice in recent history, have caused inflation to go absolutely through the roof. The problem of Argentine inflation began in the 1940s with a man named Juan Domingo Perón. Perón was a general in the Argentine military, and while acting as a military attaché in Italy, he would be strongly influenced by Mussolini's fascist corporatism. Fascist corporatism is a political economic theory which aims to organize society into corporations or associations of people with common economic interests. Under this philosophy, workers, employees, professionals, and other groups are organized into state-controlled unions and trade associations in each field of economic activity. These corporations would then negotiate collective bargaining agreements for workers and employers in the field. All of this is overruled by the typical fascist ruler. Despite the fact that Argentina never truly came to a dictatorship, even before Perón was elected president, he influenced the current leader to issue 2 decrees that nationalized the Central Bank of Argentina and bank deposits, and in turn would allow the government to control the money supply and allocation of credit. The same military government would issue a subsequent decree by which, under the supervision of the central bank, an agency called the Institute for Promotional Trade was also established with monopolistic powers to control Argentine exports and imports. These 2 decrees, which intertwine the Argentine government and economy, would prove to be a problem not only for Perón, but for all the leaders to follow him. In Perón's case, he began with the implementation of what he called the 5-year plan, which was basically a bunch of social programs to try to remake Argentina into a better nation from the ground up. However, from the beginning, it was very unclear how Perón planned to fund these programs, and when it became apparent that the funding was pretty much entirely on exporting crops, any economist would immediately question the sustainability of this funding, and with good reason. As it turned out, the world economy during World War II was in high demand for such crops, but immediately after the war ended, prices fell, and the Argentine government was left with practically no money. And when a government needs money and has complete control over the nation's economy, the inflation begins. The lasting effects of Perón's legacy is best summarized as economic nationalism, which is the organization of Argentine society into corporations with strong political power that are economically dependent on the state's expenditures and subsidies, and a lack of an independent central bank. These have fundamentally contributed to the embedment of inflation in Argentine society.
After defaulting on its debt twice recently, Argentina has now been shut out of the international credit markets, meaning that it must now pay for things up front with hard cash rather than being able to take out loans in order to pay for things. Additionally, since their currency is so unstable, Argentinians have begun to hoard US dollars to ensure that their money doesn't change value so quickly. This has led Argentina to become one of the largest hoarders of US dollars in the world, with 1 in every $15 being hoarded in Argentina. Our recommendations for fixing Argentina's inflation problem are that they amend their constitution to include more separation of powers, that they reduce citizens' reliance on government welfare by making secondary education mandatory and by subsidizing tertiary education, and that they restructure or do away with their economic nationalism and corporatism.